Decans, and welcome back to our 18th episode in our journey through the zodiacal faces. I am Elsa, and I'm joined again today by KD Dayton and David Fisher. Thank you both for being here again. So let's dive right in today, and thank you, audience, for being here as well with us once again for Libra 1. So happy birthday, Libras. Hope y'all are going to be enjoying your Decans and joining us for your birthday Decans.
If you have been enjoying our content here with this series that we're doing in the Decans, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, share with other people, and also comment your thoughts and leave an emoji in the comments just to help us spread our work.
Absolutely. And we are trying to hit that goal of 200. We're really close to 200 subscribers. So help us hit that little milestone. That would be awesome. And I like that it's 200 and we've got the 2 of swords and we've kind of got that balance and that Libra vibe. Let's hit 200 at Libra if we can. And KD, you had the dates for this Decan.
Yes, yeah. So this Decan, it starts right at the autumn equinox. So depending on the year, September 22nd to 23rd. And all the way to October 1st or 2nd. And I'm really happy that we are recording this so close to the actual equinox, because even people who aren't into astrology or studying these natural cycles have to admit that when the material world goes through such a huge shift as the autumnal equinox, there is an immeasurable and powerful effect on the human psyche and behavior. So it feels really nice that we're just about to enter autumn in the Northern Hemisphere, and it's the equinox everywhere in the world. So yeah, happy equinox, y'all.
Yeah, blessings for everyone's equinox and equinox rituals. Let's take those blessings into this new part of the year. So Austin Coppock, in his book 36 Faces, calls this Decan the sword and the blindfold. Susan Chang calls it blind equilibrium. And that is partially because we are drawing off of the 2 of swords here. And in the Hermetic deck, it's called the Lord of Peace Restored, which is interesting because a lot of times people will refer to it as the Lord of Peace, but the Lord of Peace Restored has some implications that I think add some nuance, and I think we'll start to unveil or uncover as we move through. Speaking of unveiling, the moon rules this Decan, so we've got the High Priestess for the moon card, the Priestess of the Silver Star, and then we will have with us the entire time as the Libra card throughout all 3 Decans, the Justice card. And in the Hermetic deck, the Justice card is called the Daughter of the Lord of Truth. And we know as Venus rules Libra, we think of Venus as the connector and as relations and beauty and things like that. But ultimately, Venus's beauty is in truth itself. And there we'll be talking a little bit more about justice here and the law, because we've got the Roman goddess of justice, Justia. And we're starting to view things here in terms of balance. Austin Coppock talks about there are some early images for this Decan having a horn, like blowing a horn. And this horn is sort of to wake people up. And it can be the idea of waking people up to social injustice. It's really about the sleepers and the woke. And when we're talking about the 2 of swords in the Rider-Waite series, you see a woman on the edge of an ocean, yes, or a lake, and she's blindfolded. So we've got this idea of sleepers and woke, like we can take that blindfold off, when to take that blindfold off. It's a call to justice, and it becomes this wake-up call here. So we're going to get a little bit more into those themes as well.
And just so you know, this is the Illuminati deck, and I'm holding it up because it's inspired in the Rider-Waite that Elsa was referring to. So the image is basically the same, but more kind of impressive in a way, not impressive, but
totally different style of
art. Yeah, and it's interesting, and we'll see this when KD brings her slides in, I'm sure, with the Rider-Waite. But what David presented as well is you see the moon here very vividly above the woman, and you've got the water the shoreline, that sort of double-edged sword, and this idea of like blind justice, or, you know, again, that sleeping and awake, like. And I think I'm going to dive into a little bit of what Austin says here before I go too deep into my notes, so that we can kind of unpack that a little bit. So in this phase, justice emerges. The sleeper must awaken. We've got the peace restored. The principle of balance or justice calls from the underworld. This is what I really wanted to read before I get into my notes. Calls from the underworld, or from those primordial waters, or from that element of the high priestess or the moon. We've got the spirit of the underworld, Mot, the Egyptian goddess known for her role in the judgment of the soul, wherein the deceased's heart is weighed against an ostrich feather. I wanted to bring that in because in the last Decan, if you guys haven't watched that, go back and watch Virgo 3. We talked a lot about the kind of crossing over and the embalming and the sarcophagus. And now we've got the deceased whose heart is weighed against an ostrich feather. Mot's role was more than just for stern justice, though. It also represented and enforced this philosophical and social principle of balance, which was thought to guide both the human and the divine world. So we're thinking about it in the spiritual sense, as well as the sort of legal paradigm in our human nature. We've got peace and justice between members of society are the bedrock for social order. And Mot then represents not just the soul's justice, but also social justice. And this phase has a strong legal component. And Austin talks about it's not just that sort of, you know, Venus being the ruler of all of Libra, of wanting to bring things together and wanting to find a common ground and things like that. But it's not just with that. This legal paradigm is also sort of exemplified with the Erenes, and they are mentioned in the 36 heirs of the zodiac, a fragmentary Hellenistic text that Austin mentions and we've mentioned before. The Erenes are more commonly known as the Furies, which we've also talked about in other videos, which is a trio of underworld goddesses that punish transgression against the divine law. They also, they sought out the murderer, the liar, and the blasphemer. They were servants of justice here. And again, it's being called from the depths of sort of a spiritual injustice and brought into sort of like our human, what do you want to say, like moral landscape or something like this. We've got
some ways that really reminds me of the story of Persephone as well. That is the queen of the underworld, but also of the fertility and richness of life on earth, and how she goes back and forth between those two in order to create the balance that we know as the seasons. You need summer and you need winter, because the dormancy is what allows the plants to flourish during the warmer and more fertile times of year.
Yeah, giving rest, kind of pairing it all back to give rest. And that reminds me of just Saturn being exalted here in Libra as well, sort of cutting it all off, resting, lying dormant, being cut away, being frozen, in order for that balance to come in. You know, that instead of things just like running rampant with life. So yeah, that really exemplifies it as well. So in kind of a more basic way, we've got things like fair trade, social justice. It's the true object is relationship. You know, it's like we want to be in good relation with the other. Fairness and reciprocity must underlie all friendships and romances if they're to last. And I think that talks about, again, those societal principles of making compromise in order to have a sort of harmonious or smooth running of our societies.
Go ahead. I wanted to just come in and say something about how this decan is ruled by the moon, and you have the sign of Libra being ruled by a lunar sect planet, a nocturnal planet, which is Venus, the benefic. But this is the masculine part of Venus, let's say, or what Venus associate with the most when she's trying to achieve some masculine action or something. She's familiar to that in that way, to that sign in that way. And you have to constantly grasp what's going on around you, make judgments in your life. And those judgments, they kind of put a limit around something that is limitless, which is, you know, the amount of possibilities. You choose to select some of them to weigh against each other in order to make judgments on situations. And you have to, because Venus is a feminine planet, and it's, I'm using feminine here as in lunar, it will do so, it will make those judgments, which is a masculine thing, kind of asserting that judgment is a Saturnian thing, which is a diurnal planet, very powerful here in this decan, more on that in a minute. But Venus does that by selecting that which is most like the native. So you make your judgments, it's basically all of our judgments are biased, and we need some of that bias in order to be able to function in life. Otherwise, we're just a lost Libra, that lost feeling that people associate with Libra, people who can't make a decision. Well, that's because wishy-washy, but that's because they're avoiding this acknowledgement of their own biases, which leads them to make the kinds of judgments that they make. And what these cards and this decan speaks about is, I think, really understanding that it will never stop, this need to put boundaries around your feelings all the time, and understanding what's coming from within in order to not make unfair judgments and project onto people and expect them to comply, which you know, rings true to Saturnian traits. And I'm speaking a lot about Saturn because Saturn is exalted in Libra again, and it's also got some part of dignity in this part of the zodiac by triplicity and by Decan, Egyptian bound rulership, which is the first 6 degrees. So great part of this decan is also sharing some kind of rulership with Saturn here.
Yeah, and Saturn does bring in that sort of like masculine quality. We've also got it being an air sign, which brings Venus into the mental realms as well, and into that way of judgment, where when you have Venus in Taurus, again, it's the earthly pleasures, where here it's like when you're faced with the moon as an air sign or as a masculine quality, you're sort of cutting and weighing. And when you think cutting, you're thinking Saturn again, which is just like, okay, we've got this multiplicity just coming at us. And instead of just like indulging in the sensation of that, now we're taking it to sort of maybe like a logical place or a refined place where we're saying, okay, what is all of this? You know, because we just had Virgo too, which is like that sorting of the wheat. And you know what I'm saying? So we've got that kind of mental quality of judgment of like, I love what you said about boundaries, because it's just like, if you've got this multiplicity, what is good? Mm-hmm. What is righteous then out of all of the things? And it's like making those stand
and that's
out.
why it's blind justice, right? Because you got to look within in order to be aware of your biases enough to be comfortable with your decisions.
And choice can be very paralyzing to that point, and that is, again, goes back to something that is often a Libran personality trait that's described in a lot of like shorthand sun sign descriptions, is that kind of inability to make a decision, almost because of the desire to see things from every single side. And note that I say desire because, David, you're precisely right. Everyone has a bias. They can't actually see every side of the situation. So it's kind of like a tragic cycle. But despite that general, view of Libra, Saturn in Libra, again, and its exaltation, is somebody that can exercise excellent judgment because of the precision with which they are, dealing with the matter at hand. It's like that Saturn in Libra is actually a very theoretically well-functioning Saturn. right?
Yeah, it's willing to cut away, and it can cut away. And I think that's when we're talking about the blindfold and the blind justice, and this, what Austin really stresses is the sleepers and the awake. It's like, you know, we can just let all these things pour in, but as we awaken to the multiplicity and we've sorted, we've gotten into that state of like being able to judge something as quality or as not quality, as, you know, reliable or unreliable, you know. And I think obviously with the moon and this, like, we've got this feminine moon, feminine Venus, we've got this masculine sign, so that can be paralyzing, right? Like, and that is like one polarity of it. Like it's high functioning polarity, or it's Saturn exalted would be like being totally comfortable taking both swords and cutting it away, right? And just saying like, nope, that's a boundary, that's not going to work here, that's not a part of our functioning society, right? And then as a feminine quality of Venus and as a feminine quality of the moon, that can be uncomfortable. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more with my notes, is like, when is it, how far do we have to be pushed before we're ready to say this is unjust? Like, at what penalty are we willing to be quiet, or at what penalty are we willing to speak up and set those boundaries? So, and I'm going to talk a little bit more concisely about that in a little while. David, go ahead.
I just wanted to speak about the fact that this card looks difficult, and it is, because you are speaking to, again, a conflict of interests in a way between the rulers of these different modes of dignity contained in this part of the zodiac. And this conflict seems, from this conflict, there seems to arise an image of justice, something of equilibrium, something that looks the part that it was supposed to look in a way. And it is very hard to keep those truths in balance within oneself, unless you're making a conscious effort, which for the nocturnal planets, again, is not comfortable, to acknowledge those multiplicities. But again, the moon is so multiple that you can't really do that, and you will be crazy if you always try. So it's blind justice, because you have to focus on something, but you have to just let go of the other things that you haven't chosen in a way, and that's the weighing part. And another part that I just wanted to speak quickly about is that while the moon is something more internal with the high priestess, the justice card is something more social with the scales. Remember, you only need a sword if you're going to use it against someone else. And you only need a scale if you have a system of measurements to compare something with something else, because you are trading, because you are doing business with other people. So it implies social, and it implies multiple people involved. So it is balancing oneself and one's bias with the general reality.
Yeah, it's like, how many people do we know? Like, let's say this is a little bit of a sleeper or something, and I'm drawing on the high priestess here. You got like the wisdom in multiplicity, but then at its sort of most, or at a point where it could be slightly confused, is that you have an opinion, or a strong opinion, or a judgment that's happening inside of yourself, and you don't speak up, because you don't want to create waves. And I you know, that's another Libra archetype, right? Is that I think it, and I might gossip about it, I might tell you in private or something like that, but I'm not going to tell the person, or I'm not going to like speak up about it, because I don't want to create some kind of disharmony at the workplace, or I don't want to, or even not disharmony, but I don't want to feel discomfort. I don't want to put any strain on the relationship, or whatever it is, you know. And that can be a part of it here, is because, you know, again, with that Venus, moon, lunar, like high priestess quality, and like, when is it, and in a real way, and in a spiritual way, and in a profound way, when is it good to hold our tongue and keep our opinions to ourselves for the greater good? And when are we self-denying when we do that? Or when, at what point is it good to say, you know, no, this is a boundary and that's not okay, and it's worth the disharmony and it's worth working through for the sake of the relationship, right? So Austin goes on to say, this Decan drags transgressors to court and weighs the trade of both merchants and lovers. There is no interaction not weighed by Mott, for the judgment of the heart is ongoing.
Well, I also think about when it was said the moon is internal and justice as an air sign is more social. It kind of speaks as well to the just what justice is, which is imposing an inner sense of morals and values on others, on the multiplicity, on a more social construct.
As soon as we go into tarot, I'm going to speak about it a little more, perhaps, and I think you guys too. But in this system that is very common, justice is 11, and we have a 2. The high priestess is also the second major arcana, not counting the fool as a number.
You know, when we talk about like the inner world versus the outer world, we've got like the multiplicity, the internal wisdom of the high priestess, and like the external air societal quality of that like ultimate justice. It reminds me of in the Rider-Waite, it's not really necessarily depicted in the Hermetic deck, but when you see the intersection of land and sea, you see that exact in that 2 of swords reflected back. You see that, you know, the water maybe being the high priestess, or like what's going to be submerged in that sort of like unconscious space, and then what's going to lap up onto the land where the waves hit the material shores or whatever, you know.
Is the Hermetic deck depicting a Tudor rose?
I don't know what flower it is. It very well could be. And when you think of the depths of the ocean and that kind of like unconscious, when I think of the passing of the torch of the sun, the solar quality, like I'm here and this is right and this is just, and this is, you know, it's just kind of like boldly pronouncing like where we need to go, like up until this point with this kind of like light reaching its peak. We're handing off now to the Lord of Darkness and to the lunar sect. And we have to remember that that's part of like where that conflict comes about in someone, is the fact that we would probably rather fall back into the multiplicity than step forward for justice. And we all probably can feel that in different areas of our lives where we'd rather not mess with the conflict, and we would sell ourselves out to that and sell other people out to that. We would rather not tell someone the harsh truth sometimes, you know. We'd rather not even tell ourselves the harsh truth. We'd probably just stay at the job too long or stay in the relationship for too long, because that's that kind of energy here. Is it's kind of like a bit of retreating into the multiplicity and hiding in that and allowing that sort of shadow or allowing that dark to take some of the torch, because it could be whatever it is, exhausting to step forward, or, you know, it's just kind of a little bit more, you know, it can have a retreating into the dark quality with the passing to the passing of the torch from light to dark. So what I wanted to talk about with that is it being called the restorer of peace, or it being called peace, and the peace that is an equitable arrangement that provides, you know, something to both parties. And it what will shatter that, right? Like it might take something big and confrontational for a lot of us to shatter that peace. And when is it useful to break that peace, and at what point are we going to hit that? And you know, no peace without justice is kind of where we're going with this, or no justice, no peace. And that's something to think about when we're setting boundaries for ourselves and others.
And justice is really a reflection of your choices, like as you expected. Like you can notice that when you take conscious decision, knowing your biases, the consequences are generally very manageable, independent of what they are. You know what you've done, and you are clear when the consequences hit of what equation. It's like you have this equation where you have to find the x, And when you make a mistake, let's say it like that, an error of judgment, but you were conscious of all the factors, you kind of get back this response from life that is like, here is the mistake. Here is where you didn't get the information correctly. And you can way better, better assess the situation in order to make a judgment later on. Supposing that it doesn't kill you or anything like that.
Yeah,
but
that's the thing is like it is kind of hard. Like there's the beauty of brutality, I think, here, because of, again, that exalted Saturn is like, when I think of the refinement of Venus, and I think I've said this in other videos, but I think of things like fine art, ballet, like things that take just grueling hours and extreme amount of effort, and that it can feel that way on an emotional level too, to be brutally honest, to set boundaries, to, you know, might versus right, that kind of like thing. It's just like, it's the getting up at 4 a.m. every day when your ballet slippers are bloody and like doing it again to get that sort of like perfect process. And if you think about like the process of courts, I mean, obviously they're so corrupt, but just that kind of and why are they corrupt, right? Like no justice, no peace. Like why is that such a hard thing for us to sort of maintain in ourselves and maintain in society? So,
well, this is one of the reasons why this Decan is so slow. Even though it belongs to the moon, even though it has a masculine quality with Libra, it is slow in the sense that processes like these of taking consciousness around these social issues, they take a lot of time. They take a lot of people going through the same thing. They take a lot of self-identifying with the neglected in order for you to really understand and assess what's missing in society, and you're able to make a better judgment of life through your experience and such. Multiple ideas, though, make it for a very agitating Decan. It's also a cardinal sign. Again, an equinoctial point stands here. You have Mercury also ruling 4 last degrees of this Decan as a boundary lord, a bound lord. And so what we have here is really peace, I think, with the consequences. And the thing I wanted to say about the beginning of this cardinal sign is that Schmidt refers to the cardinal signs. He talks about the sources saying that the cardinal signs are supposed to be the beginnings and endings of things. Libra takes action so things can be finalized. Libra starts the action that will end all things related to a determined subject. So again, this idea of limiting something, this idea of saying this is the boundary that will identify this particular entity, or
yeah. And when I think about like the boundary, when I think about like the courts, right, it's like a lot of times you don't have this like ultimately fair agreement. Do you know what I'm saying? You have some process of justice, but like it's very hard to grasp that ultimate refined art, that ultimate refined justice. Like most of the time it's compromise, most of the time it's messy. And when you think about like societies and what we don't like about them, where there is no justice, where there is no peace, is because you see that sort of like vast amount of marginalization retreating into those waters. Like we don't have to look at that deep like water, we just, you know what I'm saying, like you've got that sort of you know, justice for only a certain amount, or well, you know what I'm saying?
So this is actually a really interesting thing to consider about the concept of justice, is that it's not something to be achieved. It is not something that is ever actually attained. All right. And one of the ways that you can think about this is when you think about Libra being the fall of the sun. The sun is truth. The sun is singular. The sun is all. It's one. All right. And
it's focus, that's not right.
Right. It's not possible here. It's just not possible here. It's not possible in this sign. So instead here we have the first Decan ruled by the moon. And instead what it's saying here is that justice is in fact a lot of small, minuscule movements. I think Chang actually makes reference to this. She calls it a bunch of small dances going on all around to try to keep things in balance. So justice cannot be achieved because it is in fact a constant motion. It's a constant effort towards something, which again, Saturn, right? That's a pretty Saturn.
Yeah, and I think you said it and we didn't really say it explicitly, which you just did, which is the exaltation of Saturn is the fall of the sun. Now we talked about the torch being passed, but you know, let's remember that explicitly. Thank you. And yeah.
I just wanted to say that the moon ruling this decan is you cannot, again, the fall of the sun, you cannot have that kind of focus here. There's too many ideas. There's too many different perspectives. And so there is a point where you have to shut down that sun idea in order to go with your heart to make that judgment. Because and honestly, the thing that is common for me between moon and sun is being able to select that which hurts within yourself the most within that multiplicity as the thing you should focus on in that moment in order to create more balance, right? And so it does require that going within in order to make that unconscious pain conscious, to heal it. The fall of the sun here.
Yeah, absolutely. The high priestess energy.
Focusing on the pain, which is Saturn, is something the sun doesn't like to do. The sun likes the blame.
Right. And that's the moon too, tapping into the intuition as opposed to the objective outside of oneself truth.
And that can be a very, like, I think we get, like, a lot of times people will interpret the Two of Swords kind of as confusion or a decision to make or something like that. But if it is sort of this like paralyzing sort of like boundary, like, oh my gosh, I'm at a boundary, I'm at a crossroads, like, what am I going to choose? That kind of idea is really exemplified. Wait, what did you just say? The moon?
As intuition. It's, yeah. And
oh, right. The intuition of the moon being like having to weigh your emotions, like David was saying, like having it be lunar and feminine, Venus, moon, and like going into that lunar high priestess like intuition. But then the Justice card or Libra having that masculine air mental quality. And it is very hard to reconcile the heart and the head sometimes, or take one and juxtaposition with the other. Like, you know, sometimes our heart and our head, when mixed, bring us this sort of like you know, indecision or kind of something to reckon with, at very least. And I think we all kind of understand what that feeling is.
Which brings me back a little to the idea of why modern astrology gets Libra so wrong. And that's because modern astrology is commercial. It is embedded with capitalism and capitalistic ideals. And you have therefore people only focusing on the results of capitalism on a sign like this, on an energy like this, which is, you know, you have to make assessments all the time. What happens then with a brain that has to be making these judgments all the time when the narrative is no longer cohesive because you have an amount of information that the brain can no longer process?
Yeah, because
this is the indecisive Libra. The indecisive Libra is the capitalistic Libra living in a Western society, which is the standpoint I have.
Yeah, and it's, you know, it's the boundaries. It's like, okay, my heart is telling me yes, but my mind is saying like, no, that's not a good choice, or no, that needs to be a boundary, or no, that's too much for us, or something.
And we are constantly confronted with this intuition being stained by these traumas that were enforced by the incohesive narrative, because each of our parents had one ideal around what their lives should be like. And when they were together, things were just like hellish. When our families get together, each of us has this different ideal because of the speed of how technology influences us, how the media influences us in different paces, in different ages. And this just creates more separation. So we can no longer have cohesiveness within our home boundaries, right?
And, yeah,
So poignant, yeah.
Yeah, and we've been taught to sort of like our society, speaking of commercialism and like all this stuff, or like when when I think about Libra, I also think about like fashion and refined fashion, like art, fashion, all of those kinds of things. Like when I think about fashion and just like the model is expected to be just like extremely reduced in, you know, body weight and things like that, extremely reduced in diet and all these things.
How terrible beauty standards are in general across the world.
All the consumerism and commercialism, but like high fashion, I think of Libra, like high art, high refined, again, like ballet, opera, like all of those things. And when I'm thinking about, you know, just like the idea of fashion, or that, you know, the idea of consumerism that David brought up, is where society is so much constantly reducing the feminine, reducing, be thinner, be this, be that, be fat, be fat here, be skinny here, be did it, you know what I mean? Get this designer thing. And it's like, it's on a deeper level, it's reducing the Venusian lunar quality of the high priestess, which is to listen to our intuition. I think that's where confusion, or sort of one polarity, maybe a more negative polarity of the Two of Swords here, why it brings confusion to bring the heart up into the head, is because we have all these like standards and boundaries that we're supposed to have, all these restrictions in the mind, and we're really taught to ignore or not listen, or to silence, or to reduce our first, you know, inkling, even, and justify it away, like, oh, why did I feel that? Oh, that's probably not this. Oh, it's probably not that. Like, we're justifying away all of our intuitions all the time, and reducing it and overthinking it, and pretty much not being able to really hear that clear signal of the multiplicity, like that first knowing, like there's multiplicity coming in and we have an intuition about it, but then by the time we reduce it and slice it and splice it in our heads, we are confused, when really in the beginning we could have listened to that deeper knowing or that intuition. So it's
Venus is social agreements that allow us to select social status and social culture in general that will reinforce ideals that are good. I'm saying good here, are attractive for that particular people, for those
or
particular
moral
people.
or right or any of that. It's like,
yes,
we need to have some
law.
kind of, yeah, the law,
right? The law. But this today, it's difficult for us to be able to agree with things, because money is the centerpiece of everything. It's no longer the human, it's no longer the life, it's no longer preserving the good of the community. It's lost the purpose. The multiplicity that was ideal was the hive mind, let's say like that, the people working for each other and combining their efforts to survive, because you know the multiplicity of things that could kill you, it was a lot, so you had to have a better multiplicity, let's say, in order to surpass the earthly dangers. But now consciousness, or the sun principle, masculine principle, has overtaken consciousness so much that we are imposing on these feminine ideals, as you were saying, Elsa, these masculine limitations, and we are trying to use things that are lunar. Schmidt always describes that he teaches of the moon as phasic, which is a word here that means an image that appears in front of you, an appearance that speaks to you, but not an audible voice. It's like this internal siren call, Venus and moon combined, that inspires you to do something. And capitalism does that. Capitalism uses these ideals of the feminine projected onto the media, image again, things that not necessarily impose a clear law, but they set a boundary around what that expression should be for you.
yeah, and
if
like,
you look like this, you should look like that.
yeah,
Not happy about this in your body, should look like that. Ooh, we have the right product for you.
Exactly. It's playing on your desire in sort of a lying way, in a, you know, when you think of Saturn as feigned appearances, it's like you're thinking that you want this thing, or that you know, but it's not necessarily something that you do want. It's like bending your intuition in, you know, for the worse or something like that.
And you see how nowadays it's much more difficult for someone to be able to assess that internal quality, to be able to make those judgments. You have to make much more of an effort to be able to be aware of all of these influences.
Yeah, like what is your
nowadays.
own personal style even? It's just like everything is just like cookie cutter of like what beauty is. And I guess it's always been that way, but it's like heightened. And when I think about that heightened kind of like corruption, I also think about what you were talking about with the quartz, which is like, let's imagine, I mean, this is me idealizing it to the max, but let's imagine like the quartz back in the day were to provide some kind of justice between someone for disputes, right? Like land disputes or family disputes or something like this. Now, when you think about the courts, it's not like a place where like both parties are heard and da-da-da. Now it's like literally a place just for money. Like who's going to get what in the divorce? Who's going to get what for the land? It's like completely, it's like a monetary settlement area. It's not even like, I understand like it's still about dispute, but everything's put into this monetary classification, and maybe it always has been that way, but it's just something I guess that I'm thinking about. It's
well, this is very much related to that. My partner says something I find somewhat troubling sometimes, but it's true that things like fines and speeding tickets in our culture are a poor tax, because those who are rich can easily get away with it. They can afford to pay off whatever. It's just a tax for not having as much money. That's the state that we're in.
Absolutely. And that goes, you can take that concept and you can just run with it, because yes, because that is the way society is. So everything's been sort of corrupted into this like monetary space essentially, and it's a space of oppression. And I guess that would be like the feigned appearance of Saturn as well, and the kind of corruption of lunar qualities and the corruption of, you know, even Venusian qualities. When we're talking about Venus is money. Venus is money as well. So it's the corruption of the principles there, instead of the exemplification of the principles. All right, should we go ahead and share screen and get into the tarot a little bit more, KD?
Yeah, sure. Would you mind flashing up the Two of Swords of the Hermetic deck that you had?
Absolutely.
Because that flower in the middle, I knew I recognized that. I just Googled to confirm. That's a tobacco flower.
Oh my God, that's beautiful. That is
So
beautiful.
That's a Saturn association.
It's
and
also such a sacred plant within the Native American communities, and it's something that I use daily in my ritual outside in the earth. And it's a super grounding, strong grounding and beautiful element. And when you think of how most people use tobacco, they're using it not as a subfumigation or not as something to offer to the earth, but they're smoking it, which I mean, it's been smoked always, but it's been consumed in a lot of different ways in a lot of different cultures. But yeah, when you think about tobacco in a general sense, you think about air and kind of the corruption of air.
Breath being corrupted by the smoke.
Yeah, that's a really beautiful. That's beautiful. I'm glad you looked that up.
Yeah. Okay, so that was just to kick us off into a little bit of like symbolic exploration into the three cards of this Decan. Can you see the Justice cards on the screen? Yes. Okay, cool. So I'm going to start with justice that we've been talking about now for a while. So I'm probably not going to hit on too many discussion points, just pointing out a couple of things among these four cards. So justice is clearly very intimately tied to air signs in general. You see the sword in every single, well, almost every single one of these cards, except for the science deck, which has some pretty clever symbols of its own. But you'll note that sometimes, but not terribly often, justice is depicted as blindfolded, or in the case of the Marseille tarot deck, the traditional tarot deck I have here, eyes closed. So you'll see that very often among a lot of different types of tarot decks.
And Austin really stressed that in his book, as well as in some discussions that some audio discussions of him talking about the Decans as well. He really stressed the sleepers versus the awakened, the call to justice, the sounding off of like, open your eyes, take off the blindfold, like that whole like sleepers versus awake. And that's interesting because we're talking about like the sun being awake and Saturn being the sleeper, and
right. And the moon too being, you know, night, and being even if you're not actually sleeping, it's just a different space,
it's dark, it's underwater, it's on the unseen, that type of a thing. Yeah.
Again, the idea of being uncomfortable here coming from the effort that you have to make yourself aware of those biases all the time, to grapple with the discomfort that you feel from the pushback that life will give you sometimes, especially through social boundaries.
Yeah, I mean, it is discomfort to sort of address those things, and a lot of people don't even know how, and when they do, they're not going to, like, once you're on the path of awakening, or once you're woke or something, you might get more and more addicted to that sort of like self-work, or like that self-reflection or something like that, or that discomfort. But you really have to lean into that to get that process going.
And what are we talking about really when we talk about the nocturnal planets? Multiplicity means that there is too much to be able to focus. And so you have to be intuitive. You have to be able to let go of that focusing process in order to just embody whatever impulse you have in that animal nature of yours. But also be conscious enough of how those things come up for you that you can, direct yourself throughout life as those things come up. And
David,
you have to be able to be comfortable.
Yeah, I can't remember if this was in a private conversation or if we'd said this in a video, but if you think of yourself, like for a moment, get into this like meditative space, get into this little thing. If you think of yourself at night, walking barefoot in the grass.
Like talking about me.
And I'm talking about us. We're all here together, right? We're visioning ourselves in the night and we're walking barefoot in the grass. It's like, yes, you might have a little bit of light of the stars or a little bit of light of the moon, but essentially you can't see everything. You're only taking portion by portion. So you sort of are being guided through this like dark space. You might go a little slower and more carefully. Yeah, you're feeling your way through it, but it also makes you more conscious to the smell in the air, the wet grass under your feet. So it's like, you can't see everything and you're moving cautiously, but it also enhances a certain sense of awareness as well as you're sort of moving through that space.
It puts you into contact with those channels of awareness that pertain to the moon, which are your body, your sensations, the things that communicate to your spirit through earthly means, basically.
Yeah, and you have to sort of heighten that awareness of like, do I see it, or do I hear it, or do I feel it? And in the night, if you sense something that you can't see, you're going to be a little bit more aware of that sensation.
And again, slow process, because it's only through experience, through time, it's like a function, that you acquire a capacity to really understand what the multiplicity of your feelings is trying to tell you in certain situations, and you become comfortable enough to just act on impulse, on demand, let's say, limiting your actions and being able to justify them with your own morals, because you have enough experience with yourself.
And I just want to say one more thing that's coming through at the moment is like the wave. So like some Libras that I know, it's like they're being really moved by that wave, and they can be, indecisive because of that, but it's because they're in touch with that wave, right? And when I think of like the shores of on the two, or the high priestess being the moon, you're really being moved by that wave constantly. So it's like, I've heard, in modern astrology or whatever, people being like, oh, Libras are moody, or they're this, or that kind of a thing. And it's because you are being moved by that internal wave in order to find that equilibrium, right? In order to make that final decision, you might have to take the wave through feeling different ways on different days, or allowing some of that kind of like movement to happen for yourself. Those different moods, those different feelings, trying them out for size, and then weighing at the end, like how those things made you feel.
Yeah, actually, that's kind of what I wanted to talk about next, which is some of the basic delineations for Libra, but also the basic kind of concepts tied to the card of justice, and how that's very applicable to what we've been talking about. So like you say, the kind of the moodiness and also the indecisiveness we've mentioned a couple of different times. And in relation to that, I want to say that this is actually something that has been applied to all air signs at some point in time, because the ultimate question that's posed at the point of air sign I think, is what do you do with too much information? What Gemini does with too much information is completely loses focus. Ooh. What Libra does with too much information is can't make a decision. And I like to think there are a couple different types of Aquarians, but what Aquarius does is hides, stick their heads in the sand and kind of decides what their own reality is. But that's just the ultimate question of, kind of what do air signs do with too much information? And Libra is at that phase of, being maybe so in touch with the ebbs and flows of the feelings that they can't make a decision. So oftentimes when I pull justice either in a reading or in a daily pull, you can kind of think of those themes that we've talked about, like balance. Oftentimes it's one and the same, both an acknowledgement that you're having trouble making a choice, as well as the encouragement to make a choice, which is sometimes when tarot has a sense of humor. But you can also think of the devil's advocate of playing the other side of a coin, because Libra, again, desires to see all sides of something, even though, acknowledging that bias exists is inherent to anybody's perception of the world, might make that a little bit impossible.
To me, this also speaks about consequences once again, because it is how you acknowledge the boundaries many times. So if the Two of Swords happen to come up in a reading close to the Justice card or in relation to it somehow, I would associate it with the consequences of some decision that you made that had to be more intuitive because you didn't have most of the information. And if there are more malefic cards, let's put it like that, you can bet that the person made a poor choice.
Yeah.
Yeah, and sometimes that can happen like when you're learning your own boundaries, right? Like if you think of just like personal growth and development or whatever, it's like you realize that you've been boundary broke or whatever once you slipped a little past that edge and be like, oh, that's too far. Or like if you're walking in the night and you take a step to, ooh, that hurt my foot or whatever, I was going too fast. So sometimes we have to learn from making those decisions. And I think that sometimes that can be paralyzing because we don't want to make the mistake or we don't want to make the choice. And when I think of like, just trying to find the balance, that is a constant play of little mistakes, little gambles, like, oh, I didn't go far enough, I regret that. Or, oh, I went too far and I understand now that that was, a boundary for me. Because when I'm sitting and looking at the card and we see the yin and the yang, it's like, we need that passing of the light to darkness. We need to find that balance, but it is a practice.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and in comparison to Libra's opposite sign of Aries, we kind of touched on this a little bit too, where Aries can be the self. It's kind of a very self-focused sign, whereas Libra is a very other-focused sign, going outside of itself and looking for the commonalities amongst the other, because that's what Venus does. Venus tries to make connections and tries to bring things together. And
people together. It's like, I'm me and I want you.
Yeah,
or whatever.
exactly.
Or I want to agree with you, or I want to, I'm really glad you said that, KD. I didn't know if we'd have a chance to get to this in my notes, but Austin encourages us now that we're at this equinox point, we have this opportunity, and I'm going to encourage everybody to start to think like this because Austin said a fair amount about it, which is, now that we're at Libra, we have the contrast to look at the classical aspects of the Decans. So you're looking at Decan 1 of Libra is in contrast to Decan 1 of Aries. Yes. And so now we can start to get understanding about the last half of the signs in relation to the ones that we've already covered. So now we have that opportunity, because before we didn't have that contrast because we hadn't yet gotten to them. So now all of these signs are in contrast or in relationship to things that we've already learned. And
so go back and check out that video.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which speaks again to the idea of the Two of Swords, because you can only examine something that you weren't aware of if you have something else that is making you aware of it by association somehow. It's like a reflection, some kind of shadow, or some kind of like, You know, in those in those cartoons that just came into my head, where like a cartoon goes into one side of the screen and then it's like my hand coming like this, you know. It's like that. So you go like this on life, and it's like, oh, what happens if I do this? And suddenly you get like slapped in the back of your head.
It's consequence again.
Consequences. And I think that this is what the Libra one is speaking about in relation to Aries one, because if it's the self, Mars, assertion, exaltation of the sun, the selection principle elevated to the max, I don't need to think about what I'm doing because I just can do it. The multiplicity allows me by physical means, this is Mars, and this is, I learned this from Dana Lynn, physical means I can, therefore I will do it. I don't have to think about it. I was inspired, fire, I will embody it. And with this, consequences. It's like, oh, now I see myself a little better in that Martian space that I was in.
Yeah, I want to say something about that, because when we have reflection, right? The other, we have reflection. Venus is the mirror. Also, moon is the reflector of the sun. The moon is a mirror to us.
Insert Mulan's Who Is That Girl I See?
Yes.
Part of the song here.
Yes. And then, so we're reflecting back on Aries. And if you think about, you know, a lot of teachings, a lot of like self-help, Buddhist teachings, things like this, is like, once we claim our personal power, we do the self-work, right? You can be like thinking you're good and healthy and you've established all these boundaries and you're in your personal power and you're vibing, and you get into a relationship, or you go home and you see your parents and everything that you thought that you had worked on and constructed and had really strong personal power around, once it hits the reflection of the other, is supremely challenged, and we're sort of dwarfed in the shadow of the other with how our personal standards and powers and boundaries are reflected back to us. So yeah.
And the real power lies in being able to select through experience and time that which from the multiplicity calls out to you. You have to have enough experience again with yourself, looking within, to be able to, within the changing background, select that which is most like you, because you already know yourself enough. And so even if the background changes, you will be able to go towards that which sings the loudest to you and to your truth, which you are clear of, ideally.
Yeah, and it's true. And you can be, in slight contrast to that, you can be clear and true, but there's nothing like the other to sort of challenge your own reflection. Like, you can be clear and true, and you know, anyone who's been
even in that instance, like when you're having a discussion with someone and you're not agreeing, what's the way to be able to come into balance with that, even if you don't agree? And
think about how hard that is for a lot of people. Like when they're Aries, I'm thinking of the challenge of Aries, of like, oh, I think that I know and I think that I'm right, but if you soften to what the other person is bringing to you, you see this completely different perspective, and you're like, whoa, maybe I was this way or that way. Maybe I was off base, or maybe I was really strong and rigid in this certain aspect of how I thought about it. And there is another way to think about it, right?
And again, this is the fall of the sun. Because of exactly that, you're not able to focus, because there is this multiplicity air of ideas. That is always, everything is true, because it is the experience of other people as being transmitted to you, and the transmission itself will cause you to have another experience with it, as you were saying. But
yeah,
and also spiritual, sorry, just to conclude, true spiritual strength to me is, which is speaking again to that power of the high priestess, is being able, and the source, the key to making good decisions, is being able to be clear around your own biases enough, and having experience enough with yourself that you're able to, and in the idea of understanding where the other is coming from, you generate another perspective within yourself. But to me, true spiritual strength, resilience, and where you accomplish things and become notable in that sense, is when you're able to superimpose your idea, even if you agree with the other, or even if you consider the possibilities that the other is giving you, you know you have a purpose and you're able to keep steady within that purpose and selecting within the speech of the other that which will empower your focus and not theirs, even if it is something to be considered. You know,
and
this
I
is
think
the
of
true
like
power within the air signs, I think.
yeah, and I think of like the unconscious of the waters or the Saturn feigned appearances, or just things like Schmidt says Saturn sees everything except for that thing which it's supposed to, because that's the idea of the selection, right? It sees everything except for the thing it's supposed to see or the thing that it's looking for. And I've talked about this before, about this certain prayer of, if you say it's not this and it's not that and I'm not this and I'm not that, then what are we left with, right? That's kind of the Saturn thing. If I don't see this and I don't see this and I'm looking for the thing, but I'm seeing everything from which it's not, I think sometimes that Aries reflection back to the Libra is like, we need relationships to point out our blind spots sometimes, like our unconscious habits and things like that. You know, it's like, sure, we can hold true to ourselves, but sometimes part of the quote unquote compromise, like in a good, beautiful, true spiritual sense, is sometimes we don't see our unconscious failures or habits or something like that, where if in loving relationship people can bring that to the surface in a way of reflection to us, where it's like, wow, I really didn't see that I've been doing that all this time. Like if you're just living alone, Saturn, in your own house or something, someone comes along and brings in these like reflections to you where you're like, oh, like emotional reflections as well, as like, I didn't realize I was in a habit of speaking that way or thinking that way or whatever it is that's coming from the subconscious. So yeah, that personal power and knowing who we are and knowing our deeper self, which is the moon and the high priestess, and then also the reflection of the other to bring some of those subconscious things to light, which is one of the beautiful and powerful spiritual reasons or whatever lessons of the other.
Totally. Another item about like Libra and Aries that's I found sort of interesting in relation to the Justice card, particularly as the major arcana card of Libra, is that Aries is sometimes in medical astrology related to eyesight as well as the head in general, and Libra is blindness, as Justice is blind. So there's a little bit of a symbolic interest there. And of course, you know, Libra again is ruled by Venus and Aries is ruled by Mars. And so the god of war, the goddess of love, fighting for justice, fighting for peace is definitely an element that kind of comes through in the Justice card and in interpretations that you might take from the Justice card in a reading.
Absolutely. And Venus and Mars are always in that lunar dance together. They're, you know, they're the lover. It's like, why would I fight except for my family or on behalf of, you know, these Venusian qualities, on behalf of my community or something. So yeah, the fight for justice, like what's worth fighting for? We all want harmony, but what is worth fighting for? And there has to be that line, you know?
Yep. And before kind of leaving from the Justice cards onto the other cards in this deck, I did want to mention something that David referenced earlier about the difference between the 8 being in the traditional deck versus Justice in the more modern decks being the 11. With the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, the decision to move Justice and Strength, the Strength card, which is in the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, number 8, was made mostly because in astrological order, the sign of Libra, Justice, comes after Strength, which is represented by the which is the sign of Leo. So that was the reason why those two cards were switched. But ultimately, I do think they have a very deep relationship to consider when we're thinking about Justice and Strength. And numerologically, you know, the number 8 does mean a kind of balance. So that really would naturally go back to Justice. But the 11 is also a sort of spiritual mastery and knowledge. It's a master number. But even if you weren't taking 11, 1 and 1 is 2, the 2 of swords, you got the 2 swords. I don't know, it's lovely. I really encourage you to think about how numerologically and astrologically which resonates more with you, the Justice card as the 8 or the 11.
Yeah, and if you want to hear a deeper discussion on this, we did break it down pretty deeply in, I don't know if it was the first decan of Leo, but in a Leo decan. I think it's the first one because we really started to talk about that card.
Yeah.
But if you don't see it in the first one, check out the Leo decans because we really dive in for a solid treatment of that numerological issue or difference. I think it's funny that here we have that difference, that decision to make.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. So yeah,
But
make a
the two is
decision.
also the 2 is also, I go particularly with the 11 symbolism because of this 2 also association,
Mhm.
which for me comes from this awareness that I was talking about, the equation that I was talking about before, where you act and there is a consequence, a direct consequence that makes you aware of the things that you were ignoring once you took action. And normally, this happens, I feel like when Venus is in Virgo, for instance, is a way of showing that you're in conflict with things that you hold dear. They are in conflict with what calls you out as beautiful. You've been questioning it a lot. Sorry. And so, again, the 2 has this quality of action and reaction, but being a sword suit, being the 2 of swords, being a justice card, which is an air element card with Libra, it means masculine, it means disruptive, it means light bringer, in a way. And as such,
Dawn of the morning.
I didn't want to say it, but you said it.
I did.
But Venus is Lucifer, right? And she brings awareness in this particular way, in this particular decan, in this sign, through the 2 of swords energy, by showing us the consequences, the shadow sides that are brought by that natural balance that is in place, especially social. And you have the 2 of swords and the 2 energy being this, well, this is how I want to express. Well, can you hold true to your expression? Is your spirit strong enough to maintain yourself? Or are you going to get lost in the multiplicity once you're confronted with the truths behind, the multiple truths behind that one step that you've chosen to make? So there's this constant balance that the 2 offers. And the high priestess, as we've spoken about before in Taurus, is knowing how to navigate those constant changes in circumstance. We just hadn't looked at it through such a airy standpoint, through such a mental standpoint. We were looking at it through more of a circumstantial, more material standpoint rather than ideal.
So I thought this was a really good depiction as well. Justice is depicted in the science deck as conservation of energy. And just as in physics, energy is never lost. It is only transformed, gone to something else. It's the same with justice. Rules aren't necessarily broken. They're just moved into a different part of the pendulum, part of the spectrum, and that's how balance is achieved. So it's a very interesting, I think, representation of justice.
For sure.
All right, so the High Priestess, which is the card of the planet, the moon. So I have a couple depictions of the High Priestess here, but we've seen her many times before so far in the first half of the year. And the ones that I want to really point out here are T. Susan Chang in her book, 36 Secrets, did identify Persephone, as we referenced earlier, as kind of a figure that could be intimately tied to both the 2 of Swords and the High Priestess. And, you know, again, because of the ability to go below and above and find balance and bring balance to a situation, she was associated with the 2 of Swords. Here, I thought this second card from the left, from the Golden Renaissance tarot deck, is also a really poignant image of a sort of Persephone-like figure. So it's one of the most, I guess, muted depictions of the High Priestess that I have come across. It doesn't have a lot of the, what would you call it, trappings of a popess necessarily. It's a very kind of natural state figure of the High Priestess. So I wanted to include that one in our discussion today, as well as these 2 on the right, which I think kind of get at something that's also relevant to the Two of Swords, which is the occult nature of the high priestess. In her chapter, T. Susan Chang talks about Lectico Divina, or Pardes. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that second one correctly, but it references a secret communion with God. And I think that that concept is very intimately tied up with blindness as well, looking inward, and some of these other things that we've been talking about. It's really a commonality between all three of these cards.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that with the exaltation of Saturn. And you know, the golden virgin reminds me of kind of that Vestal Virgin, like carryover, just with that imagery. Yeah. There was a story I wanted to tell in Virgo, and I almost, when David brought up Venus falling in Virgo, and now seeing this almost like Virgoan kind of Vestal Virgin, or like a Mother Mary kind of figure. I remember that I remember I didn't tell this story in Virgo, and I was like waiting for the Virgo Decans to tell this story. But the idea, I'm just going to mention it briefly, of Virgo being a perfectionist. Someone told me this story about how it was the Virgin's responsibility to sort the wheat before weighing it. Mm-hmm. And if one grain of wheat had any spots of any imperfections on it, the entire granary would rot over the winter. So that's where we get that sort of nitpicking, like a Virgoan perspective, is if one tiny imperfection or one grain of wheat was spoiled and it was weighed and then sold, or weighed and then stored for the winter, the whole community would look back to Virgo and say, you didn't do your job, and now we all starve, or whatever, you know? So it's just the idea of like weighing this perfected fruit or something. And it just, that this image reminded me of
also the idea of consequences again, because you have this Virgin Mary, I'm thinking, as the mother of the divine Logos, Jesus, which translates to me as like the virgins that have to separate the wheat and all of that, because it's as if by doing that process of just stating the divine Logos, or separating the good from the bad in a way, you allow the next circumstances to reveal or be translated as that which you have selected it to be. And so it's just like pressing a start button and allowing circumstance to play out in a predictable manner. This is what this Libra Decan would like the most. But you can only do that if you've made the correct assessment of reality, if you have weighed your biases enough, if you have intuitively trusted your own ability to judge, and you did it right because you had experience with it already.
Yes, that's what it reminds me of, looking at this black and white card as well. It's like, this is bad and this is good. This is a bad shaft, this is a good shaft. And I'm sorting it, and I'm saying no, 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 and I'm saying yes, yes, yes. Go over here, go over there. This is good, this is bad, this is good, this is bad. And being able to do that, because there's consequences if you do not. And that is that kind of like border of the equinox, the sun falling, or the sun passing to Saturn, and Saturn taking reign, or the making of decisions, or that kind of like, you know, Virgin having to sort for the weighing. You must weigh, this is good and this is bad, or whatever. Like, there, when it comes down to it,
law has that job in society of separating what's good and what's bad, so we don't have to think about it too much, because those laws are integrated into the way we talk to each other, in the way we dress, in the way we do things. And so that's why laws and social rules in that way are good for the psyche.
Yeah, it's that same thing of like one bad apple spoils the whole thing, or like whatever it is, you know? And it's like that corrupted, we already know, can be like marginalization and just like extreme things that we've already talked about that can be like horrific for society.
But the selection process basically becomes marginalizing.
Yeah, yes. But at some level we still have to do it, and that's the yin and the yang, and that's why we have to have this is good and this is bad. And like Mercury wants to like play in those boundaries, but there is the underworld, and there is the movement between the two, and there is having to sort that at some point. So when we move from that mercurial kind of like movement between spaces, again in the high priestess even, right, which is this like, so this kind of like internal space, you still have the black pillar and the white pillar. You still have to make that scale work and balance, and you still have to choose, you still have to sort. One wrong decision or whatever could put the whole community at risk or something like this.
Yeah. Well, and also before switching to the last card, I want to call your attention to one other thing, which is the series of scrolls or books that each one of these figures is holding, which is very important, I think, as well, to the concept of justice, the letter of the law, the words that are used to communicate and enforce a moral code that comes from within, so just make sure to note that when you're looking at the High Priestess. So the final card that we have here is the Minor Arcana that represents this first Decan of Libra, the Two of Swords that we've been talking about, the Lord of Peace, and a few interesting depictions here are listed. First of all, I wanted to note that the twos, one kind of like philosophy of tarot is that all twos in the deck correlate to the major arcana 2, which is the High Priestess. And so you will almost certainly, not just because of this decan, but almost certainly by that philosophy, be seeing some similarities to the High Priestess, but also I think here of justice, and another card, which is the Queen of Swords. Especially in the card second from the right, which is the Micah Ulrich deck. That figure almost certainly looks like the Queen of Swords if you hadn't seen just the two swords there, and then of course the words along the bottom. I might in fact think that this was the Queen of Swords card represented. So the Queen of Swords is the suit, it's often a woman who's very powerful, a woman who has a sharp mind, a sharp wit, but can also be correlated to sorrow and things like divorce, separation, some sort of like legal trouble of some sort. So I just find it very interesting that this card kind of ties those things together with the High Priestess, and leaves an interesting flavor there to interpret this decan. All of these figures, well, that we know of, with the exception of perhaps the cat, are female, which I think is relevant to discuss. The High Priestess is certainly female, but it's a little bit up for grabs. In the pictures of justice that I shared, again, with maybe the exception of this figure that's a little bit more androgynous or neutral looking, also all female figures. So I think that femininity has something important to say in this decan, even though Libra itself is a masculine sign represented by the male. So
yeah, it is really interesting, this decan being so lunar and Venusian and feminine, and yeah, exactly. But it's like that again, that feminine quality brought to the mind, yes, which is a very interesting dynamic, and when we're thinking about like separating good from bad, you do get that cutting. You do get, well, I guess a divorce has to happen, or I guess, you know what I'm saying? And that could be, no wonder people have troubles making decisions, because those are big decisions to make and difficult ones.
Yeah. And a lot of times they do require something like a sword or a scalpel to kind of navigate those things. So it's a very, yeah.
And they have consequences. Like sometimes the consequence of decision is just bad on bad,
Bad on bad. The sword, this is the second air sign that we're going through, but the Suite of Swords do tend to be, have slightly more negative connotations than any of the other elemental kind of associations for the deck of tarot cards. So just, another warning. Look forward to that.
And if you think about the elemental qualities, air is a triplicity that is associated with Saturn and Mercury primarily, whereas fire is with the Sun and Jupiter. So you think about justice, you don't necessarily associate it with the air signs.
No.
But that's exactly what the card in tarot kind of demands here. It's like demands us to become aware of this weighing process that must happen in awareness, within your awareness, in order for you to have a good assessment of those multiple ideas that you are holding within yourself.
Yeah, and I just wanted to call to mind you know, we've got that infinity symbol again here being sort of brought back. We've got the lunar quality being brought back. I like how we've got both the crane and the woman standing on one foot here, because when we've got the yoga posture where she's standing on the ground, we also have the hanged man, which is in this position when it's upside down, right? Mm-hmm. And then we've got the, you know, movement of the feathers making this infinity symbol sort of circling those two islands. And to me, those two islands again show like two, you know, like every person is an island unto themselves or something like this, coming out of these primordial waters, which we've talked about, you know, this island depiction. I forget what card it was, but it was from the Pythagorean deck, of just the idea of the symbolic nature of an island. Yes, and then we've got the tower card. Yes, the tower. Thank you. And just sort of this land coming up from the water is this like us differentiating ourselves from the unconscious. But here we have two, and again, that's that Aries. And now the relational quality of the two, and it's kind of being circled here within that infinity symbol of kind of the merging of us with the other, or the self with the fact that it has to reconcile with the other in relationship.
And I think that if you link with the 9 of Swords video that we have, which is the Gemini 2, I think we said something similar to that. You're calling back to that. It's very interesting. It's refreshing my memory. I think we said things about Mars being a nocturnal planet ruling the Decan in particular, and that island of individuation that the tower represented is really interesting.
Yeah, and it's being called again in the air signs, right? And just this idea of relationship under the moon, like every man is an island now, but we have to reconcile with the fact that we have relationship. That means choice, that means compromise, that can mean reflection for good or for bad. And we get that again, like reflection for good or for bad, with the sun, fall, Saturn exemplified dynamic. You know, we have to sort of reconcile that here.
100%. I really like the discussion of the islands, because that's actually echoed in the Rider-Waite-Smith deck as well. I don't know if we called that out right away, but the two islands there, it's almost like, yeah, the two choices, they're almost mutually exclusive. They exist in separate spaces in among the water. So
in the subconscious.
Yeah.
And when you think about navigating those waters, I mean, Saturn is the ship, Saturn is the seafaring navigator, Saturn is the one who works on the boundaries of the water, all of those things. And when you think about like shallow waters, those were commerce waters. Those were the ships coming in and out. That was places that were safe for commerce and dependable for commerce. And when you think about, like David said, the siren, or just navigating between the islands, there's one path, right? And the other two ways, those choices are going to crash your ship or whatever. Yep. So in order to navigate commerce, or and that can be taken in sort of like a mood or a metaphor as well, but just that idea really calls to mind, especially with the Rider-Waite depiction here.
Totally. And the Rider-Waite-Smith deck as well has again, let's go back for a second to the High Priestess in that deck on the left. There's kind of a school of thought that thinks that figure is the one in the Two of Swords, the dark short-haired woman.
Yeah, it is. I think one of the schools says that all of the depictions in the tarot are actually just the Fool, the Magician, and the High Priestess.
Right, and I this think is her journey or something that we're embarking on with the swords. Yeah.
You would only have those three characters, and the Fool is kind of this result from the High Priestess and the Magician, I think, or something.
Yeah, because the Fool is Tarot, like on this, and I think we've mentioned this a few times, David, right? The High Priestess is the Empress, or we said in the last deck, and the Magician is the Hermit. And, when we're doing all of those comparisons, that's kind of, the basis on which we're
in the Rider-Waite. Every sea, every river, every body of water that you see comes from the High Priestess foot. If you remember, she has that moon.
We talked about that in Cancer for sure.
Yeah.
And the one of the things that again ties these together though is that a lot of times people refer to, and again Chang mentions this in her book, refer to the Two of Swords as the little priestess. I don't know if we mentioned this, but in Virgo 2, we had the Nine of Pentacles, and that card is often referred to as the little Empress, because they are kind of distillations, maybe less strong or major symbolism, but the same energy as that major arcana card.
The major arcana is a moment where you become aware of a truth of your own reality that is like major,
huge
shifting,
life pivot.
Yeah, life-changing direction type of stuff. The minor arcana are kind of the same energy watered down to a day-to-day basis, where you have an epiphany of, oh, of course, I've been keeping myself stuck.
And there's the solution, or there's the consequence.
Yes.
An interesting idea that I had never really thought of before is how the figure in the Rider-Waite-Smith deck almost looks like she's being initiated into like a secret organization, with the blindfold and holding the two swords. Like, we don't really know exactly what's happening there. That to me calls back to the high priestess as well, and the element of the occult that is represented in her card. Like, this could have been the high priestess when she was taking her rights to become the high priestess. So I very much love that idea within this card, as well as the symbolism of the moon behind her. I know in the Mother Peace deck on the far right, a full moon is behind the figure, and that too seems applicable in, like, you know, a moment of kind of pinnacle moment of needing to make the choice, or the crux of which way that you're going to go. But the waning crescent, which is the moon, the lunar phase, and the Two of Swords of the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, right before the dark or the balsamic moon, really is a stage of shedding or letting go of something. And I think that, again, gives a little bit of heft to the secret initiation piece, or the rite of passage into a new stage of your life, a new way of being. And it really asks you to, with the blindfold, look inward to make that next move, or to find the strength or fortitude to withstand the secret initiation rites.
And to shed, to let go, to shed, to make the decision and cut something away as well.
100%.
Let something die, and the illumination of the full moon to be able to see what that is, and then the strength to be able to let that go. You know, it's interesting you said that about the ritual, because I've always viewed this too, especially in the Rider-Waite depiction, is so ritualistic looking, you know. That's really cool that you kind of brought that to light. Thank you.
Yeah, and another thing that I hadn't thought about terribly much with this card, but it does resonate in some ways, is the relation to the unconscious state. You know, we talk about looking inward with the moon and the high priestess quite often. And we also talked about that when it comes to justice, sometimes having its eyes closed or the blindfold on. That's not the case in the Rider-Waite-Smith deck. Justice is not blindfold, but the Two of Swords is blindfolded. And so as a result, this card oftentimes can be associated with the meditative state and even sleep, which is why I thought the cat card was kind of funny. The yawning cat card is one of, you know, like, not necessarily exhaustion or tired in the way that the end of the swords are, like the 9 and the 10 are, you know, straight up burnout. This is just the starting to get sleepy stage. That I think introduces potential for a different way of thinking.
It's like a day nap, like cats nap during the day. And I wanted to talk about that just very briefly. I know we've been this is getting to be a long video. Thank you everyone for staying through. But the idea of, you know, when the moon is out during the day, right? Because in the Mother Piece, we see the night, almost like the starless night, the full moon illuminating the scene. But here we see that the moon is out. So we've got the high priestess representation, but it looks to be like relative day. And it is always an interesting thing when you see the moon out in the day, in that phase of the moon. And it almost shows, again, that sort of like that illuminating quality, and also the idea of the air or the masculine being associated with the day, but this being such a lunar and Venusian quality. That is what really stuck out to me about this, and I'm glad you kind of reminded me to say that, which is we've got the air and the masculine, the day, and the woman and the lunar for the night. Yeah.
And yeah, like her swords here as well, they're actually thought to be feathers, in fact, of the heron standing right next to her. So they aren't actually sharp swords, they're light, and they are intended to help her balance as she is doing that pose.
And again, the mods, right? The soul being weighed against the feather.
Yep.
Well, this is a bird. Birds are a representation of flying, air quality, multiple ideals, and all of that. And this is being able to balance those ideals within herself. She's imitating the crane, if you notice. Again, that two quality of being in relation to something else. When circumstance throws something at you, are you able to dance, do the dance of circumstance in a way that still maintains your balance?
Yes, a reflection of the other. Yes, a reflection
Yes.
of the other, maintaining personal balance and personal power and initiation.
So the Two of Swords is the beginning, without the Ace. The Ace of Swords is the beginning of the whole deck of the sword cards. And what I had not realized before that I read in T. Susan Chang's book is that every single figure in the Suite of Swords has their eyes closed or covered, except for the Five of Swords. So when we get to that one, it's going to be kind of a special case. But I think that that's incredibly relevant and incredibly important because of the fact that the combination of swords and not being able to see something and having to think about it, you can't, the mind needs to grasp it, not your physical senses, you know? So that I think is going to be really important for us to actually discuss throughout Libra, and probably Aquarius too, even though didn't quite pick up on that in time for Gemini. But these last two cards that I want to highlight or three cards are ones that actually kind of confused me at first about the Two of Swords. They're very different than the lunar, occulty, meditative depictions that we have seen in the other cards that I had up on the screen a moment ago. But I do think that they have a special relevance, particularly to the card of justice, as opposed to the High Priestess. So on the right and in the middle, we have what you could consider a before and after of the effects of justice. I think that the idea of a fight is really apropos for the Libra Aries axis, the self versus the other, almost the nature of butting heads between the god of war and the goddess of love. So these two dudes are duking it out. They're really fighting, and you could assume they are fighting over ideals. They are fighting over words. They are fighting over concepts and abstract theories, as opposed to something more like serious or, I guess, material.
Yeah, you have the fox and the snake there in their helmets, meaning that one is acting more with the cunning spirit in a sense that they have a plan that they're trying to execute in a kind of under the covers kind of way, not so clear way. And the other, the fox, is more intuitive. They're just examining the situation, carefully trying to take the best advantage that they can of something that's not so clear to them, but they're
and you can see that
trying
they're
to take
holding
advantage.
hands. So this is the
Yeah.
after. This is where they've somehow reconciled their different natures and their different needs. And so yeah, it's very interesting. These two very different figures that are and somewhat at odds, but they are reconciling. So
when I think of this, I think
depiction-
of houses coming together. Like if
Yeah.
you're making contracts or bargains, like when I say houses, I mean like, clans or tribes or two people coming together for mutual benefit, or like how that, in the fighting over like who's going to take territory and what's going to be the benefit, brothers fighting, or in this case, you see the martial one kind of on the downside of the fight and maybe the Venusian or golden one sort of on top. And when you were saying about the cunning, David, I was thinking the fox as the cunning and the snake as the representation of the high priest.
Yeah, I might have my words mixed up. I'm foreign.
Yeah, no, just that idea of like there's and just two opposing people making, or maybe not opposing, but like ideally making an agreement that serves both houses, making a compromise, like sorting out a fight. Yeah, it's interesting. I like this little play. And then the action, the apple action. Let's talk about that.
Action. The science deck has this depicted as what we might think of as like Newton's laws of gravity. You can see that the other two cards indicating action and fighting, but this is kind of like indicating that period of balance as well. More similar to the High Priestess style, I think. However, in the justice depiction, this is right now out of balance. And so the arrows are indicating the movement that needs to happen for it to come back into equilibrium. And kind of a definition of this, basically calling back to the two of swords making a decision and having two decisions hanging over your head like the apples, and what movement is going to be necessary to bring them back into balance. And the final thing that I want to say, a really great quote from T. Susan Chang's chapter on this Decan, is that she kind of encouraged people to think about when they draw the two of swords, air signs, they're like breath. And so it's like, take 2 breaths to pause, to meditate, to perhaps explore your subconscious a little bit. And that is how these most fruitful and potentially just decisions are made.
That reminds me of like the inhalation and the exhalation, or the yin and the yang. You can't have the tobacco too, but it's like you can't have the inhalation without the exhalation, and that's that balance of the yin and the yang again, the two sides of the breath, that give us life.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been a beautiful discussion. Thank you both so much for being here again. And again, happy birthday to all you Libras out there. KD, you want to tell people where to find you, and then David as well. And then I'm not sure, KD, you want to bring us out with the poem again this week?
Yeah, you can do that.
Awesome.
You can find me on Twitter at KD Dayton, Instagram KD_Dayton, and my website kddayton.com.
Awesome.
Yeah, and mine is In the First Place Astrology. You can find me there on Twitter, and my website is inthefirstplaceastrology.com. You can also find me on Twitter at First Place Astro, and on Facebook In the First Place Astrology. And I'm on YouTube as well.
Awesome. And you can find me at elsasastrology@gmail.com. That email is in the About section of this page, and you can feel free to email me for a reading and to connect. So thank you all so much. Thanks for getting us to 200 subscribers, and we will see you at Libra 2.
This poem is called Invisible by Jose Garcia Villa. My body is a bottle of white glass. Why has not somebody poured red wine into me, that I should become beautiful? My body is a green leaf. Why have I not dried, that I should blow away to infinity with many winds?
Da soma kena mata iba nako di ma na mekana soa en soa ate iba na ke uju no ba ikana kamai da onga i